Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Left Hand. And we want to let you know that we have noticed a large influx of patrons since our last episode. We want to welcome you to the Left Hand Extended Universe, which, of course, includes the sibling podcast Acid Horizon and the Acid Horizon Research Commons. This year, Emma and I have been putting together a series with friends and regular guests like Bob Langan, and we want you to explore more. Earlier this year, Emma taught a course for the Acid Horizon Research Commons on acid communism. She's currently teaching one on anti-civilization, which means we have an archive full of classes, and we are about to celebrate our 1-year anniversary. So navigate to the links below to find the course archive at Acid Horizon Research Commons and check out our upcoming courses. Today, we are exploring some ideas that have been circulating between me and Emma and appear in her writing on her Substack account, Elf Theory. We are taking a look at the meaning, function, and political implications of astrology and those who are interested in astrology in the year 2026. Is astrology in any way adequate to explain or interpret the world that we live in today? What are some ways that astrology positively counters the epistemic norms of our society? Okay, let's check in with Emma.
Well, it goes back a few years. I remember maybe in 2022 or 2023, I saw something on Twitter back when I still used it. Someone posted something to the effect of, why are so many boyfriends dismissive towards their girlfriend's interest in astrology? And an acquaintance of mine retweeted that with the comment, because astrology isn't real. And I don't personally believe in astrology. And what I mean by that is that I don't subscribe to the idea that there's a mechanistic relationship between the movement of celestial bodies and our personalities and what happens in our lives and so on and so forth. But I'm not convinced that what it means to believe in astrology, or at least the substance of belief, is the same thing as subscribing to this idea that there's a cause and effect relationship that extends from the cosmos down to the level of our personal lives. I'm not entirely sure that's actually what most people who take an interest in astrology, I'm not convinced that's what people who believe in astrology are actually thinking, or that somewhere in their minds there's this notion that there is this causal mechanistic connection. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. And that even if there are people who would sign off on that, it doesn't entirely capture what it means to have this interest or to have this belief. So seeing that dismissive remark, astrology isn't real. And that's why as we see, there's this pattern that is sort of a stereotype, but I think it has an aspect of truth to it as well, where it's a relatively gendered interest. To put it casually, astrology is feminine coded, it's also queer coded, and there are these discrepancies that we see in casual social settings. So this remark, both to me, was incurious about what's actually going on with astrology, because I think if you reflect on it for more than just a passing moment, you would quickly see that there's more to this than what immediately meets the eye. There's a slightly misogynistic aspect as well to this remark. And ever since then, for the first time in my life, over the last few years, I've been sitting with this. Sometimes I think that I'm either taking it way too seriously or not taking it seriously enough. And that's part of what's held me up in developing this piece about astrology, the nature of belief, the nature of what we call pseudo-science, is that I don't want to short sell the people who are very earnest about it in a way that I think is actually overrepresented in the dismissal. While at the same time, you'd probably get a lot of people saying, don't overthink it. It's not really taken very seriously by most people who talk about it and read about it and so on. So I haven't quite known what to make of it, but I have found that our conversations, the conversations that Craig and I have been helpful in trying to tease this out. So this is a long time coming, but some of it for me is about gender, some of it's about epistemology, and all of those things relate to political theory. So there's a lot to get into.
This might be a weird place to start, but I almost want to have a sort of cards on the table moment between the both of us, between who you are now and who you have been. At any point in your life, did you have an interest in earnest in this, or did you pursue astrology with a genuine curiosity and maybe even provisionally take on the belief that it was true?
Many years ago, I had a boyfriend who was really into Vedic astrology, which is, I believe, associated with Hinduism, but I could also be getting that completely wrong. So if I'm getting that wrong, my apologies. He himself, not being of that faith or raised with it, he just sort of spontaneously took this interest in Vedic astrology. But because it was really important to him, and there were a lot of what Jungians would call synchronicities in our relationship, like really very strange, particular coincidences between just like a tattoo that I had and a tattoo that he had, which these are both like abstract works of art that are not at all common. It's like there were so many things like that there was this aura of woo around our connection, and it was hard then to ignore some of his more woo or occult interests. But this is not traceable, I think, publicly to a particular person. So I'm not compromising anybody's anonymity here. But I will say that one of the reasons that relationship fell apart was also because he was sort of a reactionary woo person too, which I realized later on. He held some beliefs that when we were still together, and then certainly after we broke up, I was like, whoa, that's like vaguely anti-Semitic. Like this was right around the early years of the alt-right, like right as that term was hitting public consciousness. So there was some of that. So after that all ended, it actually reinforced my critical thinking about all of this. Aside from that, and that was really just not a very long period of my life, I've always just been on the outside of astrology. I've sort of understood why people like it. And at the same time, it's driven me crazy because I could never even participate in these conversations like for social rhetorical purposes without feeling a bit silly. So I'm like the killjoy, uncool, unfun person in conversations, I guess.
I think there was a time in junior high school where we would get the newspaper every morning, well back before the cell phone. And of course, you go to the comic section, and what's right there too is the horoscope. And so, I would read it just for fun. And maybe I partook in some of the same sort of social dynamics that Adorno outlines in the essay that we'll talk about, The Stars Down to Earth. But I don't think I put a lot of stock in what I saw in the paper on those mornings. But that said, throughout my life, I did have an ongoing relationship with what we might call magic, the occult, the mystical. I grew up in a fairly stringent Christian context. My immediate family wasn't like that, although families around me were. So some of the surplus pressures that my peers experienced kind of bled over into my family. I'm the guy coming around with the Dungeons and Dragons book. I'm the guy coming around with the Tao Te Ching. I'm the guy coming around with the Bruce Lee videos and things like that. And all of that stood to threaten the order of things, as it were. That said, amongst things of the woo variety that I was interested in particularly was Druidism, and this one book called The 21 Lessons of Merlin, which I still have on my shelf, actually. It was at that time that I think I undertook some experiments in imagination and magic as they were outlined in the book. I probably even did. I'm actually very sure that I did some of the spells and rituals that were in the book. And I think even amidst doing them, there was always just one little voice in my mind, like, what are you doing, man? This is bullshit. Like, this ain't working. But there was also another part of my mind that was saying something to the effect of, I'm happy that you are providing this sort of imaginative focus to this issue in your life. Right. And so I was contending really with the voices of rationality and irrationality. Since then, I'm the kind of guy on vacation. I will always go into the crystal shop. I will go into the New Age shop. I like the smells and bells of it. Whether or not I buy into it metaphysically, I don't really even think it matters that much. The answer is that at the level of belief and the impact of certain ideas, such as astrology, crystals, and what have you, as having a sort of concrete impact mechanistically on reality, I'm exactly with you, Emma. That said, being somebody who was once very committed to the ideas of James Hillman and the sort of broader archetypal psychology enterprise, I still believe that the kind of experiments and indulgences in imagination and the aesthetic domain are something that are very important for us to live meaningful lives. Now, the thing is, they don't even have to function or occur through the idiom of archetypal psychology. Every now and again, you're going to meet somebody who it doesn't seem as if they have specific metaphysical commitments to the kinds of things that astrology is putting forward. But you can see, for example, the kind of liveliness that is invoked when they talk about a dream that they had and the impact of that dream on them. And it will be very hard to disabuse me of the power of those kinds of conversations, those kinds of meditations, and the impact that they might have for the way that we live our lives. And I think, and this is one of the reasons that I do Left Hand, is I think our commitment to a broader politics involves creating this space for what we ordinarily deem irrational, but doing so in a way that disabuses us of some of the ideas that you've brought up right here at the beginning, Emma, which is astrology an empirical science, for example? I think the answer is no, because it doesn't have easily falsifiable predicates.
What you're saying right now is actually helpful for me for thinking through this question I've posed to myself over the years, which is that I'm not an anti-woo person by any means. I'm also exactly the kind of person who will go into the crystal shops, the magic shops. One of the saddest side effects, as far as I'm concerned, of the legalization of recreational weed in many parts of the United States is now that head shops, to me, have lost their aura. They've been sanitized and secularized. They used to be these magnets for a certain type of energy, and that's beginning to dissipate, I think. So I'm right there with you. I've always kept at least a few packs of tarot decks around. And my version of your teenage reading was Robert Anton Wilson's Sex, Drugs, and Magic, which I just wore that book down. And like the entire thing is now covered with marginalia from when I was 16. So this has been a part of my life and personality as well. But astrology in particular has been this pet peeve of mine. And I guess one of the reasons that tweet that I was originally referring to really stuck out to me is because it drew out that issue again, where I am not on the side of the person, the stereotypical boyfriend who just kind of humors his girlfriend's interest in astrology. And then when he's behind the keyboard at night, probably under a pseudonym that she doesn't know about, is talking shit about it. I'm obviously not that kind of astrology disliker, but it has been this particular just thing that I can't think my way through. But maybe it's because more so than so many other bodies of knowledge that fall under this category broadly, the irrational, which is definitely not the same thing as the occult, but if we can just provisionally put them under the same heading for the sake of conversation.
I mean, one thing that James Hillman argues, and that I completely agree, is that even what we understand as rational science has an occulted image of thought to it. And we can unpack that later, but please continue.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's right on point. I was just going to say astrology has the patina of science. Something that I really want to fold into this conversation sooner rather than later is Michael Gordon's critique of the concept of pseudoscience. So Michael Gordon is a historian of science at Princeton University, and he's written a few articles pointing out that as an analytic category, pseudoscience tells us absolutely nothing about the phenomena to which it's applied. That label is purely negative. It doesn't say anything about the shared internal features of, for example, astrology, homeopathy, Reiki, tarot, all of these things that people might refer to as pseudoscientific are defined through that label simply by the fact that they are not science. But astrology in particular, I think, fits that label of pseudoscience because it has the appearance of a certain order and systematizability. Unlike a lot of other, maybe witchcraft, like broadly construed, it doesn't have this neat ordering that seems to constitute it. But astrology is all about ordering and the kind of theoretical distinctions that seem to be based on an epistemology that we can really trace down to a physical basis for its first principles. Now that's not true. And it's almost like what annoys me about astrology is that I want to say, you don't need anything to have the appearance of science in order for you, as the hypothetical astrology believer in this case, to have access to the magical world. The plane where we're countenancing the unreal or the irrational doesn't need to come at us through the lens of the scientific, and the fact that it seems to almost be ennobled in this way, to me, is symptomatic of something that, at the very least, we should think about reflexively and not just accept. I mean, for me, it's reading fiction or just acknowledging and honoring the fictional in novels, short stories, film, TV shows, and so on is even more magical than something that has claims on reality vis-a-vis having this connection to scientific epistemologies. But I think for a lot of other people, the opposite is true. And that to me is what, or I'm just saying this now, is like, I think part of why this has just been sticking out in my mind for so long.
Just going back to this example of the boyfriend getting on Reddit late at night and complaining about his woo-woo girlfriend. It's the kind of thing that even in my most sort of rational / materialist phase of my life, where the pendulum swung in the direction away from the imaginal and the symbolic and more firmly into the scientific. Not that I was ever of the same ilk of somebody like Christopher Hitchens, but definitely that era of the internet had an impact on the sort of general vibe about how intellectualism was unfolding during that time. But there would be instances, and I can't recall them specifically, but I want to say that like I have observed instances where, on the one hand, if there was a woman in particular who had astrological beliefs, it would certainly raise the hackles of my own skepticism, not because she was a woman, but because it was astrology of the variety that you're mentioning, that presupposed that the alignment of the stars and celestial bodies had a direct, unmediated impact on the mechanistic unfolding of the world as we know it and its measurability scientifically. At the same time, if I stood outside of that situation and I were to witness a man criticize a woman for maintaining those sorts of beliefs, it would raise a different set of hackles for me. One, because like you're saying, there seems to be an implicit or undercurrent misogyny within those kind of comments. Even if I thought in my own case, I was not being misogynistic because I was being critical of the ideas themselves. But then from that third person standpoint, I would also be offended by the idea that there couldn't be someone who was motivated and interested in the irrational dimension of being human. And there, in those instances, I would see both of those things. And the conflation of those two things into one criticism seemed even doubly offensive in a way. Because one of the things that you and I talked about is how these things take on a kind of political importance, where in the case of some women, let's say, who adopt astrology as a sort of paradigm or heuristic for understanding the world, there is in that a capacity for a line of flight from the epistemic norms of a predominantly masculine and patriarchal world. I mean, my argument would be, if I don't believe that astrology is true science, that there is some notion of truth, a form of imaginal play, if you will, where play is a very serious thing. It's not subordinate or secondary to the work of science, but it is within that world that it's almost like a crystal, so to speak, in the sort of Deleuzian sense, where a new world and a new epistemology can be constructed, and new ideas about who we are, who we can be, who we are becoming, can all be articulated within a space or beneath an umbrella of ideas or images that aren't familiar to what we understand to be the sort of royal science of the 21st century.
Absolutely. It's a delineated space for a kind of ritual theater, and we need these spaces. And this is a point that's been made using different concepts and phrases on this podcast, I think multiple times already. But we do seem to be sorely in need of those spaces today. Absolutely. You describe your reactions to a situation where you might be hearing a man misogynistically speak through his female partner's astrological beliefs, and all of the different sorts of thoughts that brings up for you and the difficulty associated with holding those thoughts in tension. I've often found myself in conversations with other women where men are not present, or a group of people that is, if not exclusively women, then the other members would be gender expansive people, non-binary people, queer people, the straight white guy. The archetypal straight white guy is not there. And I mean, I'm also including this racial dimension here because, I'm speaking about a certain type of mentality. I don't want to reduce it to any sort of reified notion of race or gender or sexual orientation, but I trust that people listening kind of know what I'm getting at there when I refer to the archetypal straight white guy. So in these conversations, that guy isn't present, and then the conversation turns to questions about what our signs are respectively and what that means. And the same kinds of things come up for me. And in those conversations, I will never land on the side of explaining the complexities of what's going on with me in that moment. Not because I don't want to on some level. I always do want to connect with people at this level of complexity when it comes to the topic of astrology. So I really do want to be having this conversation that we're having right now, and not just with you, but with a number of other people. But because there is, as I briefly referred to a few minutes ago, there is this social rhetorical function that's prevalent among the not straight white guy communities, where it is, I think, a way of telegraphing certain things about oneself. One of them is comfort with epistemic ambiguity. So once somebody opens up the conversation about how they're an Aquarius, et cetera, then you've passed over into a specific realm intellectually that is a little bit deviant from what we're supposed to occupy as adult human beings in the modern world. And when you follow them on that journey, you're telling them something about yourself, and that cultivates a certain intimacy with that person or that group of people. But there's another thing that occurred to me as I was rereading Stars Down to Earth for this conversation. And here I might go to a passage, actually, if this sounds good to you. Okay, so this is in the Routledge version that I have. This is the book. It's on page 49, sort of early on in the essay. Adorno writes, "The modern occultist movements, including astrology, are more or less artificial rehashes of old and bygone superstitions, susceptibility for which is kept awake by certain social and psychological conditions, while the resuscitated creeds remain basically discordant with today's universal state of enlightenment. The absence of ultimate seriousness," and that word seriousness is in scare quotes, "the absence of ultimate seriousness, which incidentally makes such phenomena by no means less serious with regard to their social implications, is as significant of our time as the emergence of secondary occultism per se." So this idea of secondary occultism, as I read it, is about this proliferation of bodies of knowledge, of which astrology is exemplary, that are not really at the heart of the occult, but are rather abstracted from it through this filter or appearance of being something sort of different, something that has a more allegedly empirical basis. When he talks about the absence of ultimate seriousness, I think about the fact that astrology today, in the 2020s, and really throughout most of my life, going through the 90s up to today, is really never of the sort that foretold doom. I mean, there are astrologers, even in this day and age, who will forecast catastrophe and really include some very high stakes things in their predictions. But mostly it's something that can go in breezy magazines or just be shared sort of in a playful spirit. It relates to relationships. And, it's never very high stakes. So what I'm getting at here is that astrology seems like a very safe way to venture into the mysteries of the irrational. It doesn't empower people in the same sense that we can attribute to magic, as in the magic that you were talking about, like spell casting, ritual magic, or chaos magic. It doesn't empower people in the same sense as magic or as technology, because you can't use it to directly manipulate other people or worldly affairs. You can't use astrology to cast a spell. You can't use it the same way you use anything that we would call technology. You can't use it to invoke a direct causal force. And there's that part of it. And then there's the part that most of what we interact with as astrology, it doesn't get into seriously heavy stuff. We're not forecasting doom for the most part. And so, as a topic of conversation among people who are outside the figure of the straight white guy, it also reinforces, I think, this sense of a kind of power that we don't associate with that archetypal straight white guy. It's not direct manipulative causal force. It's the kind of power that's more conjurative or summoning than directly dominating brute force. And I think that people kind of sense that. It's another way of reinforcing a sense of shared identity at the margins, meaning the kind of identity that's not the straight white guy identity, of holding a certain kind of power that isn't recognized as power so much in our society, while it's doing all of these other sort of things to reinforce friendship, all at this very subliminal level. And hopefully I'm not making way too much of, you can see how much I've been overthinking astrology's social function here. But I don't know if any of that lands for you.
It does. Really lots to say. Let's start with Adorno, because one of the things that he tries to do in Stars Down to Earth is take on this notion of what he calls a pseudo-rationality, where when you read the horoscope, for example, it's not like you're getting some world-shaking, profound, prophetic intervention. But for him, what he's noticing, and he's looking at the work in the LA Times of an author named Karl Reiter, Writer spelled Righther, for anyone who's interested. But for him, what he notices is the kinds of advice that's given at this time. And when was this written again? This was the 1952 to February of 1953, thereabouts. So basically the winter of 52 and 53, actually, that's when my mom was born, and she's a Capricorn. Well, I think what's important about his construct of pseudo-rationality, and this is something that I can totally get on board with, is whether or not the astrology that you read in the newspaper pertains to genuine astrology, or whether or not Karl Reiter is a true prophet in the world of astrology. The way that it appears on the page in black and white is, for him, what he calls any sort of biphasic splitting of the day into time slots, where there's particular kinds of phrases that are pegged to either what we might call work drama, the drama of everyday work life, and the drama of family and leisure. And often those things are iterated in a weekly sort of balance. So if you're a Gemini like myself, over the period of 1 week, it is likely that you would see a relatively balanced assortment of advice related to work and to leisure and so forth. And for Adorno, this presupposes a kind of naturalization of those contradictions under capitalism, that there is something distinct called the work life, that there is something distinct called the family life, that there is something distinct called our leisure time. And here is a more or less precisely balanced set of advice given over a period of days and weeks to help you calibrate accordingly. Nothing is said there, like I said, like Gemini. And what's today's date? August 13th, 2026. Now's the day to fucking break it, burn it all down. You never get the burn it all down message in the horoscope or anything of that sort. It's all pretty like pedestrian, banal. Just smooth over your family dispute, drive carefully, make sure to take some extra time this weekend, whereas maybe you didn't last weekend, that sort of thing. And that raises the question, like you're saying, that there could be a genealogy socially amidst the various phases of capitalism, one could imagine, where astrology maybe transforms or morphs depending on, and not just astrology, but any sort of mystical practice or discipline in accordance with the social contradictions of the time. That would make sense to me. I mean, these days, I've been doing some more yoga. I do yoga at home as a health practice, as a kind of personal meditation, and I don't really invest much more in it than that. It's like, oh, this is some time to myself to get in touch with my body, and I don't attach too much direct metaphysical importance to it, although there is some, I'm sure. That said, I will go to the occasional yoga class where you will have teachers say the sorts of things that echo some of the sentiments that we hear in something like astrology, where there is a self-soothing dimension to it. It is about sort of mitigating the stresses from the outside, uplifting or valorizing the notion of and importance of a kind of self-care and maintaining a particular sort of equanimity-driven notion of the self that is more or less insulated, or at least provides space for that. And all of that stuff is great stuff. But then, of course, it raises the issue of the political importance of things like self-care, especially when they're detached from political awareness, political consciousness, and so on. Where if you pay anywhere between $20 for a single yoga session, or you get a pass for a month for $125 or something like that, you can partake in a daily, weekly, 3 times a week sort of practice where you diminish your anxiety, where you reduce your stress, engage with your body in a more or less depoliticized way, at least explicitly depoliticized. Whereas many of the stresses that that drive people to spaces like that have a roundly political dimension to them.
Absolutely. I have tried several times and failed to become a yoga person. I mean, I stretch, and sometimes I go through the poses that I've learned in my various wanderings, fraught wanderings into the world of yoga, that I, for some reason, just can't get into it as a hobby. But I do wonder a lot about the place of yoga and secular meditation that's still formalized and relatively institutionalized for a lot of people. So if they have meditation groups that they go to that are secular, or they engage in mindfulness practices in a relatively regimented way, what that's doing, or what these spaces and boundaries between like those practices and everything else in their life, the fact that they devote this time and they have this sort of circle around, whether it's yoga or meditation or something proximal, it both brings them more into themselves. It allows for a certain kind of escape from the outside, as you were talking about. And then it's got this semblance of helping one get in touch with that which transcends worldly affairs, even if it's not tied to a particular religious or spiritual tradition, as it often isn't, especially as far as I understand in the Western world. I know a lot of people who say that yoga as it's practiced by Westerners is sort of wrong-headed because it's been so severed from its religious origins. But I don't really know what to say about that. There is this flight inward and flight outward at the same time that bypasses the level of the general or the social, where you're going into yourself and then you're making contact with something more transcendent, or at least a lot of people see it that way, and not connecting either of those levels to the remit of the social and the political. I'm afraid that I'm not putting this very clearly, but I suppose if that's understandable enough in the words that I'm using for that, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. There are times that I think that the inward and the sacred conceptualized as both going more deeply into oneself and also transcending the social and political plane, or the world of shared social reality, just as that kind of movement within and then without, bypassing the level of earth, the social reality level. That's actually the best way to do that. And then there's another part of me that thinks that the very fact that we're not integrating those movements into our social and political affairs has a lot to do with all of the problems that we're facing today, and with the evacuation of something really important from our shared social substrate. And in that sense, maybe secular yoga and secular meditation would be the enemy.
I think the comment that I'm about to make now is essentially an argument against my previous comment, because I would admit, and maybe this is a bit of a prolepsis because I can already hear people coming after me after that first set of comments. There's a way that we can conceive of spaces like a yoga studio or a yoga collective group, folks who meet in the park, as a way of creating a kind of vacuole of non-communication, or just a space apart from discourse, which is just as frustrating as anything else. And it would be completely disingenuous of me. Once again, here's the sort of underlying metaphysical / ethical commitment that I have to yoga. Is one of the reasons that I do that is to create that space, right? And albeit it's a mildly consequential political maneuver, maybe absolutely inconsequential political maneuver on my part, completely individualized choice. Nonetheless, it is something that I do to deal with the stresses of this world. And I will just say bluntly that there have been particular personal 30-minute yoga sessions that I had that were getting into it or coming out of it. I reflected on the fact that, like, shit, I'm feeling a lot of grief right now about things that are happening in this world. And what I did right now was palliative care. Whether I articulated that, I'm saying it out loud right now, but these thoughts just occur as small blips when I do this sort of thing. I think it's absolutely important to have spaces like that because no matter what sort of revolutionary context or environment that we create, those are the sorts of things that I would want to have, because if there was a full blown revolution, we would absolutely need palliative care. We would need that sort of collective space to get quiet, get away from the noise, in conjunction with any sort of in the trenches revolutionary work, if you want to put it that way. I mean, that said, for some of us, just struggling to get away from the incessant chatter of tech devices and discourse and everything else, what might seem like a modest move might be politically, or completely inconsequential move politically, can be personally transformative too. I definitely put stock in that. And so, I mean, I am torn in one sense. I think really what it is that the political critiques of some of these activities don't stack up high enough to surmount their importance at a personal level sometimes, if that means just being able to maintain, which in itself is a political act, right? Just being able to survive and get through it without being overwhelmed.
As I'm hearing you speak and think about these tensions, obviously both of us and everybody who is involved with the broader Acid Horizon universe, as a co-host, as somebody who's teaching for the Acid Horizon Research Commons, has explicit political commitments. Sometimes those commitments are more front and center for their public identity as compared to others, but there is a politics that runs throughout everything that we're doing here. Or perhaps I shouldn't say a politics, but there are multiple politics, but politics absolutely holds so much of this together and is inextricable from whatever all of this madness is. So there's that. And I think that for many of us, not just you, not just me, but those in this community broadly construed, we do see these things as tensions. On the one hand, we want to be both creating knowledge, contributing to conversations that address politics, both at the theoretical level and also at the practical level, because a lot of us are involved in forms of activism, organizing, and all of that. And on another hand, part of, I think, the aura and spirit of these projects is connected to an attraction that a lot of us feel to the aesthetic, to the irrational, and to a certain spiritual and healing dimension that you can honor through the practice of yoga or the practice of meditation or through whatever participating in religious life might look like for one person or another. As it is, what we might think of as tensions and what we might set ourselves to the task of resolving, I can't help but think that's mostly manufactured. I know quite a few people who are real hippies. I mean, they, in their public identity, in their way of presenting themselves, the way they dress, the way they speak, that's just who they are. And if you called them a hippie, they would probably sort of laugh in a very warm way because they know that it's true. I would take issue with anyone who called me a hippie, but I have some friends who are real true blue hippies. And for those people, I sense a greater unease around getting quote unquote seriously political than I do among those that are more directly connected to the Acid Horizon projects, for example, or a lot of the people in the academic communities that I've been running in for a while, because almost all of those are extremely politically inflected as well. And this sense of unease, I think, is the other side of the anxiety that you were just describing, where they're worried that if they were to show up at the meeting of Marxists or anarchists, if they were to start posting in such a way that makes politics kind of the master signifier for their public identity, then that would violate something sacred about their being, because it's so tied up with, now our sense of identity in this day and age is so tied up with the way we present ourselves to others. Obviously, because of social media, that's mostly what I'm thinking of. But I think that logic flows into almost all aspects of people's social lives, even the stuff that they do completely offline. The problem is basically one of reified identity, perhaps. And when people would criticize the political thinker, the political content creator for letting their spiritual freak flag fly a little bit, I think that there's just a lack of high-minded thinking about all of that these things come back down. I guess this really marks me as being on one side of this divide, if there's anything to divide. The very conversation to me seems to be politically posed, because it's the politics of identity, not in the sense that people talk about identity politics, but the politics of identification, perhaps I should say, that makes all of these things appear to be in contradiction in the first place.
I wanted to go back to Adorno a bit, because it's interesting, because this time around, years and years after reading this for the first time, I have some criticisms of the essay that I wish I would have had initially when I first read it. First of all, the Adorno that we see in this particular essay is one who's coming down firmly on the side of reason and rationality, and is antipathetic towards the return of myth, especially in its sort of polytheistic, sort of woo-woo form, as we see in the form of a horoscope. I think Adorno correctly identifies the deployment of astrology in this greater apparatus of the media of the time, which is the LA Times, the newspaper, and the way in which something like astrology can be reduced to an everyday consumable, bite-sized commodity, and that people's lives can just be kind of moved along by what at first blush and what ultimately might be just these statements that aren't grounded in any sort of empirical fact, like we said, but whose authority is invoked on the basis of being attached to some sort of cosmic authority, which is astrology, right? And what he's saying is this is symptomatic of the sort of yielding of one's agency that ultimately leads to things like fascism. And so arguably there's a treatment here not only of astrology in the raw, but in the way that it is rendered into a broader apparatus of capture that is modern media. Now, with that said, I think ultimately the move that Adorno makes here is wrong on two counts. The first count is his complete, in this essay, a complete jettisoning of irrationality, to the point where he wants us to claim not only our faculty of reason, but he wants us to grasp onto our autonomous capacities that would allow us to overcome the very things that are repressing us, like mass media. That said, I think one of the ways that he does that is by deploying his own version, his own sort of bastardized version of Freudianism, that I think it floats the idea of a kind of ego ideal that's fraught with its own form of lack. He talks about lack of self-esteem, the way in which astrology tends to cultivate a kind of dependency amidst this real possibility of being an autonomous individual if we only get the ego subjectivity right. One of the things that Adorno is demanding that we do here is to push further into reason and basically like sink into or settle into what he sees as the dominant universal state of rationality. Because one of the things that he says here is that And this is exactly what you mentioned in your pass at that particular quote. Artificial rehashes of old and bygone superstitions that remain basically discordant with today's universal state of enlightenment. So that's the lane that he's sitting in. Where I'm at with this is in a world where we are firmly oppressed by capital, misogyny, racial issues, and so on and so forth. I'm more inclined to press into the curiosity about one's own affinity for the astrological idiom. What is it about that draws me as a form of self-knowledge? And what it might reveal to me, I mean, there's many things that it could reveal to me, but this is a tricky one, once again, because this presupposes that we are working firmly within the imaginal register. And where I probably line up with Adorno a little bit is that one of the dangers of working within the imaginal context or the imaginal register is something that we've brought up time and again on this podcast and Acid Horizon, which is there is this tendency to want to reify things like archetypes, reify astrology, reify dreams. We kill somebody in a dream or have sex with someone in a dream. Damn, do I want to have sex with that person in real life? I think a more responsible and really ultimately a more imaginal approach is when we tend to those images aesthetically, they are going to bring to bear certain insights that don't have a direct import on our empirical reality, but they're going to create resonances in addition to cultivating the habit of practicing aesthetics, which is something that we ordinarily don't do in a brutally consumerist society. Like even today, I was just walking downtown and just took care of some errands and I went into a stationery shop and just started looking around at all of the journal blanks and the way that it inspires within me this kind of guilt. Because, I mean, think about it. What is a journal blank but a book with a lack? It's just empty pages ready for you to fill. And there is this kind of romanticism about like going back to the pen and the page and that sort of thing. And, sitting down like with your chunky theory book and like just going through 10 to 15 pages in your journal as you sit at a coffee shop, taking notes and unfolding your insights. And those are the sorts of things that we don't have, that I wish I had more time for these days, despite what it is that I do end up spending my time doing. But what I found interesting in that moment is that just the sheer presence of these journal blanks and all the stationery as a commodity, like immediately brought on all that anxiety. Right. And so I think there is something where even the aesthetic activity of journaling and everything surrounding it has been so overcoated by commodity culture that sometimes it becomes overwhelming to think of the prospect of even doing something aesthetic with it. And some of us simply just don't have the time to indulge because of our work or family life or whatever, to do the kinds of things that walking into a place like that tends to inspire within me. I don't know. I mean, this is my personal experience. I'm kind of projecting it onto others. But all that said, I think there is a relationship that we can maintain with the irrational, with the imaginal dimension of our lives that involves us leaning into it rather than trying to shore up more power for reason, more power for the ego, more power for the subject. Because in the end, I think the kind of thing that Adorno is arguing for in this essay is ultimately, even though his notion of the ego ideal comes with some caveats, I think it's ultimately going to recapitulate the kind of footprint of subjectivity that capitalism and modernity is already exploiting in some way. Whereas something like the idiom of astrology, the idiom of magic, the idiom of dreams tends us to pull us out of ourselves and creates those moments of desubjectivation and aesthetic experience that I think has the power to cause a break or at least a lapse in our ordinary daily subjectivation, if you will. If there is anything like an agency, which is a really complicated word here, I'd prefer to think of it. If we're going to think of it in terms of subjectivity, it's kind of an intersubjectivity with the imagination. But I tend to see it more as a yielding to images, opening a space for them where if you create this vacuole where the non-rational dimension of our lives can be explored and enjoyed, then I think we can become less susceptible to subjectivity traps.
What you refer to as the vacuole, what I would just think of as a sheltered space, or what people might call a sacred space, a bounded space, is to me a space that can be delimited by relationships. And everything that you are saying is related to my interest in astrology's social function, the way that astrology conditions certain dynamics between people, whether in the context of a relationship between two individuals, close friends, romantic partners, or a group of people that perhaps only come together to share space for an evening, but still create a circle, even if it's only for a few hours or something like that. When astrology enters the conversation, you begin the journey into the imaginal. And what you refer to as the imaginal realm, I think, is the same place that I was describing when I used the example of a conversation free from the figure of the straight white guy. And I can't stress enough that there are plenty of straight white guys who are into astrology. I'm really speaking in figurative terms here. But if we can imagine that as a social dynamic where the logic of, maybe a better term is just the mainstream capitalist subject and the subjectivity and epistemologies that go along with that person. In the social context where that presence is not present, people agree to go on a journey into the imaginal once astrology enters the conversation. And in doing so, they countenance the irrational, they honor the aesthetic in a way that's very different from the images of the irrational and the aesthetic that we are sold. Because we're allowed to have relationships with the aesthetic on the terms of capitalism, as long as it's on those particular terms. Often it's impossible for people to think the aesthetic, to honor the aesthetic, without connecting it to an image of themselves. And by image, I mean a profile, something that you can literally project through a social media profile, your taste in music, your taste in fashion, your social habits, and our imagination of what is aesthetic becomes flattened onto the spectacle. However, when you're in a social setting where topics of conversation are coming up spontaneously, where you're allowed to air your feelings and have them validated by others in the moment and be seen very deeply in the moment in a way that doesn't tend to happen when you're alone behind a screen or alone sort of deep in your own thoughts at work and not really existing in your workplace as your full self, with the spontaneity of being seen and heard in the moment in the way that comes through in a natural social dynamic. Those natural social dynamics, what can prevail within the context of a conversation between two partners or friends who come together spontaneously, can't be commodified, at least not fully. No matter how hard they try, you are going to be able to create worlds and actualize parts of yourself and go on journeys that cannot be reduced to the commodifiable. And that's why friendship and relationship are more important than ever, I think. And because we absolutely need these vehicles for exploring the imaginal realm. And I know that I'm conflating a few different terms here, that the aesthetic, the irrational, and the imaginal, depending on which thinkers and traditions you might be referring to, are all sort of different things. But just sort of for the sake of conversation, we need vehicles by which we can access everything we might associate with that. And astrology is one of them. The way that we're talking about it now is consistent with What Adorno appears to be arguing for, not in this essay, although there are times or there are moments in this essay where sort of the Adorno of the dialectic of enlightenment comes back a little bit, but he does basically land on the side that you're saying. But the Adorno of the dialectic of enlightenment wants us to be participating in what we're saying becomes possible, what's potentiated by the idiom of astrology, as you've just described it.
I've been looking for a long time to find a place where to put this, but maybe this is the conversation. There's a very notable case. It's actually not promulgated in the Anglophone world, but there is some literature on it in Hungarian, I believe. At least I saw like a Google translated version of it, which discusses the return of Georg Lukács to the Hungarian Communist Party in 1945, whereupon his restored influence led to what then became a purge of non-Marxist scholars from the Hungarian academic milieu. Among those included was one scholar named Karl Kerényi. Karl Kerényi was an associate of Carl Jung. They once wrote a book together and on mythology. And Kerényi was active in like the Eranos lectures and that sort of thing. And it's kind of hard to place where Kerényi's politics exactly land, just like it is Carl Jung. We can call them centrists. I mean, maybe liberals of a certain stripe. Maybe Kerényi was more of like a conservative humanist, if you will. But he was somebody who's well respected in the field of mythology, but was firmly anti-fascist. And now it's hard for us to imagine a world today where somebody who's identified with a conservative movement is public facing, is anti-fascist. But that said, it was a different historical and political context. Lukács, his interest in socialist realism and like the arguments like with Bertolt Brecht aside, went about starting a discourse which ultimately led to various professors losing their jobs on the basis of the fact that they dealt with mythological themes, which I find interesting. Upon the fall of the Soviet Union, and I think maybe it was like 1992 or 93 or thereabouts, Kerényi's status was basically reinstituted by the Hungarian state and acknowledged that his excommunication was fallacious. So what I think is interesting is I'll say that politically speaking, although I'm not a Stalinist, I mean, broadly speaking, I would consider myself a Marxist versus the politics of Kerényi. However, I think Lukács's intervention in this case is emblematic of something that we see quite often on the left, where there's such a reaction to the notion that the subject of myth, the subject of imagination, and so on and so forth, must be fully circumscribed by the Marxist idiom in order for it to be valid and right. And I mean, this even comes with the notion of socialist realism as it was realized under the Stalinist regime. And therefore, at least in the case of Lukács versus Kerényi, I mean, I'm kind of on the side of Kerényi in that he was an anti-fascist. He was against Hitler and everything else besides. I might not have agreed with his conservative politics, but the idea that we are excommunicating intellectuals on the basis of their handling of myth, to me, just seems completely erroneous. But those were very different times. I mean, now, the world we live in now, I don't know what fucking world we live in right now and how things would be handled today. I mean, just looking at the kind of Ron DeSantis inflected world that we live in, I can't imagine we would be getting away with much in terms of doing left-wing astrology in the classroom. But I think the ultra-rationality of Lukács and the form of rationality that we see in the stars down the earth and not what we see in the dialectic of enlightenment leads me to want to cast Adorno and, of course, Lukács here too, as doing something I think that's politically dangerous, especially for the left as we understand it today. I mean, and just to kind of bring this conversation full circle, those people in our world today who are most prone to experimenting with astrology, magic, mysticism, and so forth, I think there is politically on the left something to be reclaimed there, because what those people are affirming in that instance is a rebellion against certain normative structures that oppress, and they're the very ones that the left are fighting against. And therefore, I think we should create an avenue by which these things, or at least we should applaud or support those who take that avenue as a means of exploring the kind of anti-domination that's motivated by misogyny, motivated by racism, and so forth. I don't know if you have any thoughts that you want to finish up on, Emma.
I think that there's a tacit acceptance of the mythic and imaginal among the right that has to do with what I see as a fundamental psychological split between the right and the left. Again, speaking very broadly, there are undoubtedly many exceptions to this picture that I'm about to paint, but the person of the left, to me, does not account for themselves, their individuality, their own idiosyncratic spirit as a part of their political thinking in the same way that the person of the right does. I think that the person of the left is fundamentally a realist in the sense of a drive to align their political thinking with that which can be observed and legitimated beyond themselves. So when I say realist, I mean somebody for whom what we represent, whether we're in the realm of art or what we're representing in our political thinking and communications and action, all the different types and avenues for the work of communication and representation, if they're in a realist register, that means that they are corresponding with realities that precede and exceed the recesses of the individual, the ineffable spaces within ourselves that come out through a non-realist creative expression. And that element of the self, those dimensions of the self that are fundamentally murky and ineffable and that come up as patterns of thought, patterns of feeling that we can convey through artistic expression, can also come out through political expression. And I think that is more true for people who tend to be more attracted to right-wing ideas as compared to left-wing ideas. And I think part of the exhaustion and burnout that is so common for people on the left, especially if they're intentionally participating in activism or any kind of political work or communication, has to do with this denial of self, this basically, to put it in extremely simplistic terms, not accounting for their own needs as part of their politics and also part of their ethical thinking. And this distancing from myth, this instinct to attribute everything woo to the reactionary, or to at least say that, we need to really keep it in this extremely small box or look down on it or what have you. It's not going to be helpful, especially in these times where we have a lot of work to do if we're broadly on the left, however we might identify more specifically. And we need to keep our spirits strong. We can't let go of that which actually invests life with meaning, those deep parts of ourselves. And yeah, I'm sort of making your own point, Craig, the point that you just made it in different words. But this is the danger that inheres in taking the new Marxist, Lukács, that approach and bringing it into the 21st century. I think it's just going to cause a lot of strife and set us back politically. And that the precursor to that is going to be a lot of individual pain. I think, in fact, that we're already seeing that. And that's what we're trying to work against, or at least I'll speak for myself and say that I would like to fight that.